Hi, and thanks for joining us for Mastering the Next Generation of Washington Science Standards. My name is Francis Vigent, CEO here at KnowAtom. My life before joining KnowAtom 10 years ago is as a high school math teacher and an elementary and middle school STEM specialist. I've really enjoyed the opportunity to speak with you today about these new standards because KnowAtom as a group of educators who specialize in helping schools and districts specifically align to the next generation science standards through curriculum, materials, and professional development. We're most excited about the new standards because they represent a major shift towards developing students' critical thinking skills, and specifically their creative, evaluative, and analytical thinking skills. And so the way that we really see that happening, and the really best context for that to happen, is through science, technology, engineering, and math, and placing children specifically in the role of scientist and engineer as the way of learning the content and experiencing the practices and developing the skills. So when you think about things like materials and curriculum, those things really just serve the purpose of supporting the classroom in delivering a next generation inquiry experience. The way that inquiry experience really comes together really relies entirely on the teacher in the classroom to create a culture of inquiry and to act as a coach. We're going to take a look at how that happens as classrooms in Washington are transitioning from that traditional model of instruction to a next generation model. I guess 4 key areas that I want to look at over the next hour are: what makes the next generation standards tougher? How do they link to Common Core ELA and math? And how does this transition to NGSS in Washington affect the pedagogy for science instruction through K through 12? One of the questions that comes up with a lot of talk about STEAM, science, technology, engineering, art, and math, is the idea that art and sciences are integrated or should be integrated. And there's some misconceptions among that, and also some really important points that we ought to discuss, because the bottom line is that the skills we're teaching in science and engineering context now make children better communicators and better receivers of communication, which is exactly what art is. Art is engineered communication. So thinking a little bit about that. So without further ado, I want to jump right in and just talk quickly about the Washington State implementation timeline. So Washington, obviously adopted back in October 2013, and things have been in process for some time. Now, most states have an implementation timeline that more or less mirror what's happening in Washington. So one of the key differences here is around assessment. So in Washington, the sort of prior assessments based on the 2009 learning standards for K-12 are still kind of in use, and then what's happening is the new assessments are being developed and are intended to be phased in. With 2017-2018 really being the target, the spring of 2017-2018. So you may see some samples in 2016-17 or different pieces of that nature, but the actual implementation of the testing is a bit further out. I guess the place where most folks are at this point is really trying to refine and implement refine their understanding of NGSS and implement curriculum and a instructional experience for students which is well aligned. And that's really tough for folks for a number of different reasons. And we're going to go through a bunch of those. One has to do with the fact that the new standards are based on the nature of science and engineering, and unfortunately most people's curriculum are not. So the nature of science and engineering, according to the new standards, is science is knowledge from experimentation. Scientists ask questions and they answer those questions by developing experiments to test hypothetical answers. So that's what a hypothesis is. They use the evidence they gather to form an evidence-based conclusion. Knowledge from experimentation is science, so science gives us scientific knowledge. Engineers, on the other hand, use that knowledge to solve problems. So they identify and then solve problems by developing potential solutions, their prototypes, and then they test and scale them. But the purpose of the testing is really important. If you don't test your prototype and yield data and use the data to form an evidence-based conclusion, then your engineering is really crafting, and you know, that's inappropriate. So think about engineers as developing prototypes to solve problems, and then testing the prototypes, gathering data to decide whether or not they really do solve the problem or whether they should be refined or replicated. So that's how we get technology. It's not always something physical. It could be software, it could be processes for quality control. Math's at the center of it all purely because it's the tool for communication. It is how observations are quantified, analyzed, evaluated. It's also how procedures and these planned investigations actually are replicable, because without math we have no specifics. Sum is not a quantity. 5 grams is a quantity, but sum is not. A lot is not. But 10 pounds or 10 kilos is. So math helps communicate, evaluate, analyze the evidence that we get, and that's really key. In order for children, so students should understand this cycle. They should know what role they're in, what role they're not in, and what role these different components play. Teachers should also be aware of that. Now the problem starts here, because the traditional model of science instruction in Washington and most other places is that content flows through a teacher. And when you think about that, you know, it's problematic, because the teacher is basically acting as a filter. And so students are distanced from the content in this scenario. But the bigger, I guess maybe more visceral example here is that the teachers in this traditional model are playing the role of expert. And so the student-teacher relationship kind of is the following. The teachers model the facts, they demonstrate the phenomenon, they explain what things are. And students play the student role of absorbing everything that they hear and see, and then they demonstrate their proficiency by recalling all of it. So that's where recalling facts, repeating demonstrations, and summarizing phenomena are kind of like these lower order thinking skills that come to be sort of a measure of student proficiency. So that's changing. That's changing in a very big way under these standards, or at least it should if it hasn't already. So in a next generation inquiry model, basically what you have here is the practices dimension, which is all about skills. Students are internalizing those skills. They're learning them. That's how they're becoming skilled. And they're using those skills to develop and use the content and connect that content to its phenomenon, its systems behavior. And so the teacher's role is not the expert, but as the coach, strengthening the relationship between the student and the connection between the student and the content. Now, when you think about teachers tuning that inquiry environment, that's really what their job is as coach, to tune that next generation inquiry environment. So they do that by adjusting the supports, by helping students understand how to engage appropriately, and by redirecting and monitoring those student teams with the full release responsibility. The student's role to demonstrate their proficiency is to demonstrate the expectations, to actually develop and use the content with their skills, to use their skills to solve problems and answer questions. Also, to when you think about cross-cutting concepts, to be able to use that systems behavior to understand and describe dynamic interaction. So that's what we're talking about here. It's really, it's really about the student developing and using the content. and accessing it through the skills and not through somebody's explanation, which they're going to forget, be bored, and have no framework or experience to sort of articulate an understanding and network concepts. Okay, that's the traditional model. So when you think about that next generation model, you can understand why the next generation science standards are designed the way they're designed in terms of their layout. The practices are the skills that are required to develop and use the disciplinary core ideas, which are the content, and by developing and using that disciplinary content, they get to see and master and understand the connection between the content and the cross-cutting concepts, which are the system dynamics or phenomena. Now, the standard is a kind of a misnomer. The standards under NGSS are performance expectations. So these three dimensions that I just talked about form the context, or some of the boundaries of the context, in which a student is going to be expected to perform the expectation of developing a model to describe the movement of matter among plants, animals, decomposers, and the environment, in this case, these specific elements of those dimensions. And you have an assessment boundary that kind of lets you know, hey, this is, a little too technical, so the idea of a molecular explanation of transfer, which would be kind of like carbon cycle, might be an example of this. And then also kind of a clarification statement which helps focus folks on the fact that we're talking about food chains, food webs in this situation. So for peak alignment and equip guidelines for science, these standards should not be happening in isolation. So this is not, while this is a grade 5 specific standard, it doesn't only occur in 5th grade. It actually should be introduced in earlier grades and reinforced in future grades. It also should be pooled with other standards from the same grade as well as other grades, so that students are not just sort of being drilled through a standard, but really are understanding that these different performance expectations are connecting with each other. That's the purpose of pooling. So, and also it's important because if you are under the false impression that grade 5 standards should only happen in grade 5, then what you're doing is you're opening systemic gaps in your curriculum and in your instruction, because students are going to come and go, they're going to be sick, they're going to be developmentally in different places, and if you only have that standard in 5th grade, or let's say in 3rd grade, then if a student appears in 4th or 5th grade, despite maybe putting all the effort in the world in, they have not gotten exposure and an opportunity to master that standard, when quite frankly, and the thing is that the elements of that standard as well. So quite frankly, it's important from a systems level to be really clever about how you articulate your curriculum this way. It's really important, especially the larger a district gets. It prevents systemic gaps, and especially ELL students and so on. There's a lot of good reasons for that. The science and engineering practices are those skills that I keep talking about. That's what the students need to be able to demonstrate. Not only with the performance expectation, it's really the tools that they need to be able to use in order to demonstrate those expectations. So a lot of times teachers will look at this and say, I do that. Well, it's not an issue of somebody doing, and it's not the teacher that has to do this. It's a student who needs the skill, needs to possess the skill and be able to apply that skill in a context that is not the result of direct instruction. And so look at these keywords here. It's the student that's asking the question, defining the problem, not only using a model, but developing it, not only carrying out investigations, but planning it, analyzing the data, constructing the explanation, arguing from their evidence. And the thing is that it's their evidence, it's their explanation. It needs to meet the expectations, it needs to be accurate, it needs to be well reasoned. It needs to be supported with evidence and so on. So all of these pieces come together. They're interrelated. They don't happen in isolation. So one of the problems is that people think that they can take their prior curriculum and just add the practices in. And it's something that's being advocated by sort of the tribes of folks that go out from DOEs across the country. And what they don't realize is that there's an opportunity to misinterpret that if your curriculum has been designed around the practices, then tweaking it a little bit is not going to be an issue. And so thinking about that next generation inquiry environment, if your curriculum has been designed around a traditional model of instruction where you or the teacher that you have in mind is basically playing the role of expert explainer, then that's not going to work. These practices don't fit in that kind of piece, that kind of curriculum. And so you have to be careful about looking at curriculum and having a unit that says is about maybe light and energy, and seeing light and energy in the standards and thinking, oh, you know, obviously this is something we can align, because it may or may not be. Nonetheless, those practices are applicable K-12 all the way from kindergarten through 12. What changes is the number of variables, the depth and complexity of how the students are employing them, to a sense. So it's the kind of responses that you get and the depth of thinking that you get, and you know, as children change developmentally. So nonetheless, here's a couple of students engaged in carrying out their plan at the second grade level as scientists. Here's a couple of fifth grade students actually engaged in planning their prototyping and testing as engineers. And you can see here in that change in depth and complexity, they have blank composition notebooks where you can't see it in this image, but these students are using the same practices and processes, but there are a few aspects which are not developmentally appropriate at this point, which have been facilitated, but they are still using them and seeing them and understanding them in their context, and that's being deliberately pointed out so that those students are being readied, and this is part of that intentional nurturing process, for the next grade. So these two students, and I'll just give you a sense of how our model works, and it works really well. We've used it with hundreds of thousands of kids here. So you basically are starting with nonfiction reading, which is not designed the way a textbook is designed, but instead designed the way that a newspaper uses a real-life context to explain a concept, and scaffolds those over the course of you know, one page to the next. It's the way that the readers, nonfiction readers, are structured. So we take a concept and we anchor it in reality, and we use the vocabulary and context and then build that context. So that lays the background or the foundation of something to talk about, really, and concepts anchoring. And so then students engage in Socratic dialogue, so thinking about, you know, the teacher is no longer in that lecture model, but what they're doing is they're asking skillful questions that require the students to respond using creative, evaluative, and analytical thinking skills in the context of the content that they've read about, as well as their personal experience, place-based connections that are unique to the community. And when you think about that, the teacher's not validating the students' responses as much as they are bringing in other students to bring information and to either counterclaim or verify or support or refute what a student's claim is, and then creating these triads throughout the class discussion. And the purpose of this is so that students, whether they're actively participating or observing and being looped in or so on and so forth, the way that a Socratic dialogue works. The point is that there are concept to concept, concept to self, and concept to world connections that each of those students are making as a result of having read that real life anchored nonfiction reading, and then had a Socratic dialogue that are bringing out these connections. You get to a point where you can actually transition to a problem or question and break into these kinds of teams. So this team is at that point, and they have a problem they're trying to solve. The whole class is trying to solve it, but they're all solving it in different ways. They have a set base of resources, and so they have to look at those resources and use the engineering design process, frankly, to come up with a solution that nobody has shown them, that's their own ideas, and they need to collaborate to do it. So they plan it, they do it, they carry out the plan, gather the data, use the data to reflect on that prototype, decide whether it's refined or replicated. And what I'm describing to you is a use of process and practice together. That's really vital in this next generation inquiry environment. And in fact, it's so vital that I want to pause and mention it because some folks are under the impression it's kind of a bit of a, I don't know, it's kind of a simple, anyway, it's kind of an underthought position where people think that process is not a, under the next generation science standards or whatever, like the progressive position to take is that process is not a part of science and engineering, that the scientific method or engineering design process basically are obsolete. And it couldn't be more wrong. And I'll tell you why. Because process is just basic logic. And the process of science and engineering is really not, we're not saying something's linear, we're not saying something's prescribed, but what we're saying is that using logic, and by teaching children logic, they are better equipped to go from a problem to an evidence-based solution, or from a question to an evidence-based reflection on that hypothesis or hypothetical answer to that question as a scientist. And so that is a way for a student to go from an idea to a high-quality solution. It requires all of the practices. Those are the tools for executing the process. And so an example of this from a different content area would be an example from writing. And when we teach children to write, to go from an idea to a high-quality published work requires the writing process that we teach them. So brainstorming, drafting, peer editing or editing, revising, and then publishing. Well, in order to engage in that, you need the practices of writing. What is that? The practices are the tools. What are the tools? Word choice, voice, sentence structure, so on. So knowing voice and sentence structure and tone is not sufficient to produce a high-quality published work. However, in combination, by applying those skills within the context of a logical framework, then what you do is you get high-quality work. Now, the thing is that in all cases with processes are nonlinear. People think that they're linear, and it's just basically because people don't think far enough. So, and what I mean by that is that the evidence you gather through the data by carrying out a plan, an experiment, you gather data, and then that data gives you evidence that you reflect on. And then that is the point where you begin to iterate, because after you've reflected on this evidence, you need to decide if the question wasn't answered, well, what's another hypothesis? What's another potential answer? Or perhaps you expose information that leads you to new questions, and similarly for engineers. So that's where it becomes nonlinear, becomes iterative. Engineers are, quite classically don't solve the problem with their first prototype. It needs refinement, and so that's at the conclusion where it's not ready to be replicated but actually needs to be refined. You get this kind of reboot, this iterative situation where refinement happens, a new prototype or a tweaked prototype is created and then tested and so on. So to say that the process or scientific method engineering design process has no place is just unfortunately a little bit naive. And then on top of it, it's kind of the equivalent of saying that we don't teach children to step forward because people do not walk in straight lines. The idea, it's really, I guess it's kind of almost at that level. So this environment where children are engaging in planning, they're generating nonfiction text. This environment is integrating all of the ELA and Math Common Core requirements for technical subject standard requirements, communication writing requirements, as well as math practices. So your science curriculum is not a substitute for ELA and math curriculum, but what it does is there's a great deal of overlap and synergy, and it's an opportunity to apply, reinforce, and really experience those standards outside of ELA and math drills. The creative, evaluative, and analytical thinking skills cross over all the disciplines. So keep that in mind. What's only science is the experimenting, prototyping itself, frankly, and maybe some of the discourse, but really that gets into the ELA communication standards. So when you think about the next generation science standards, what I want you to really think about is Bloom's taxonomy reorganized. rearranged in a sense. So traditionally, Bloom's taxonomy is 6 levels. It is remembering, understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, creating, with remembering at the bottom and creating at the top, lowest to highest order thinking. Well, with the next generation science standards, creating, evaluating, and analyzing really happen simultaneously, at least they ought to in that next generation environment. So the focus, you can imagine, if a student is being challenged to think critically with these higher order thinking skills and Socratic dialogue, and then to use these critical thinking skills to engage in planning and then carrying out their plan, analyzing their plan, evaluating their plan, creating a claim, and then using evidence and reasoning to support that claim is all higher order thinking happening simultaneously. That's why we place create, evaluate, analyze like this. And that's something that people struggle with. A lot of people, when you ask, well, you know, what's your highest hopes? You know, it's the students will apply what they've learned. Well, yeah, no. You know, that's lower order thinking, understanding, remembering. These are things that are necessary, but they're just not sufficient. And you see that in the new testing. And so as you think about the next generation of Washington testing, the thing to keep in mind is places like DC. DC has been kind of spearheaded the NGSS aligned state standardized testing. And they've been working on this for a few years. In May 2016, they became the first in the nation to have deployed, operationally deployed an NGSS, you know, statewide assessment. So, and other states like Illinois have gone to them, created an item agreement, and are borrowing their test items as their own assessment. So, keep that in mind. The test is not a test of one single grade level. So when you think about the assessments that are coming up your way, this is another flaw with teaching, you know, grade specific. You know, you take the grade specific standard and you only teach it in that grade. Then you create those gaps, whatever. But if you're only teaching science in 5th grade and that's your science test year, then, well, guess what? That science test is testing that grade level standards as well as all the previous ones. So, you know, your colleagues will be leaving you hanging, and it's actually leaving the children hanging because they're, you know, they could have mastery on what, you know, grade specific standards they learn, but, you know, if they don't remember what's gone on in 3rd grade, if they came late to the district, if they only got science in 5th grade, then, you know, they're at a loss. These new next generation science assessments are computer-based. It's kind of, you know, why they need to be computer-based is sort of anybody's guess, aside from the efficiency of moving the information around and transmitting it. The items are still open response or constructed response as well as multiple choice. In this case, they have what's called a tech-enhanced item, which is really like a drag and drop. Here's an example here on the left. Bunch of animals, and they have to be dragged and dropped into their proper place in the food web below. But then they piggyback onto that a constructed response or an open response, where the student has to explain the shortest way for energy to get from the plants to the fox, or from the lettuce to the fox. Now, this is the equivalent, and you know, it says item 2. This is kind of the equivalent of, well, almost of a multiple choice in a sense, because over here you can see item 3, you have a scenario, and you have a multiple choice. In this case, it's select 3 out of 6, because there are 3 correct answers and 3 incorrect answers. Again, changing the game mathematically when it comes to students sort of eliminate an answer and guess. Now it's not that easy. And then piggybacking onto that, a open response in which the student has to look at this food chain and now relate it to how matter gets recycled back into the environment through life cycles. And in fact, another food chain, so this is part of a food web, a food chain that involves a bacteria who return, let's say, a dead minnow's material, matter, back into the environment, where it's taken up again by the algae and so on. I want to back up, though. You see item 2 and item 3. Trevor and Kayla are mentioned here. This whole assessment's kicking off with a larger sort of scenario where Trevor and Kayla are these fictional students in a classroom where they're developing their understanding of how beans grow by engaging as scientists to grow beans hydroponically and traditionally in soil. And there's a procedure in here, an example of how their apparatus was created in the scientific diagram, and then data and intervals where the data was collected. And lo and behold, the two students come to different conclusions. And so the student who's taking this assessment is asked whose claim is correct. They're asked to study the data and the tables and the claims made by the fictional students. Whose claim is correct, Trevor or Kayla? Explain why Kayla or Trevor's claim is correct. Use evidence to support your claim. And so back to thinking about the students whose picture I showed you earlier, being able to logically progress from a problem to a evidence-based solution really equips you for using those practices to look at how somebody else has attempted to do that, find the flaws in it, and use your own reasoning to support a claim about who's right and who's wrong in this case. And analyze the data table to get that evidence, because that's where the evidence comes from. It's not because the data table said so. You have to be able to find the mean, median, mode, difference of an average here or something in order to support you. So that requires analysis. So this sets the stage for these other questions. It's that ecosystem, plant growth and development context with those same fictional characters showing up. And then you can see multiple choice again, but related to a scenario. And this has to do with different ways that matter is, trash is matter, food is matter, which if we compost it, we can return it back into the environment. Return it to the environment in a way that is useful to these food chains and food webs. So, and again, a multiple, 3 out of 5 in this case. And then you look over here, scenario and a constructed response. So this is the assessment you should be expecting, and not the identify which of the following is not which of the following is the sedimentary rock. Or, yeah, I mean, just, which of the following diagrams shows light reflecting off of a surface? Those kind of questions are, they're dead and buried at this point. I mean, they're lingering just in these transition years till the aligned tests are in place across the country. But in Washington, it's the days are numbered. So part of the reason, so at the crux of all of this is a new definition of effective science instruction or STEM instruction, which comes from the National Research Council, who was a key component really at the genesis of the Next Generation Science Standards, and who really played, they created the mold or the cast by which the Next Generation Science Standards were made. So this is their definition. Effective science instruction capitalizes on students' early interest and experiences, so that means it starts at kindergarten, pre-K, follows the children. Identifies and builds on what they know. That means it's thoughtful, scaffolded, articulated September through June, intentionally, concepts intentionally link and so on, but also from that pre-K all the way through grade 12. Furthermore, it's providing them experiences to engage in the practices, and the practices, engaging in the practices is specific language. That's the science and engineering practices, and that's why I show you this picture again on the right. It's students engaging in those practices authentically, not what you see on the left, which is that traditional model where they're not engaging in the practices, they're engaging in trying to absorb what this teacher's doing so that they can then go do that. So, doing is again mechanical. We want students who are actually being in that role and on the forefront with their thinking. So sustaining the student interest really has to do with a rigorous scope and sequence, and not 3 or 4 units a year under the old sort of, kit model. Things need to be much more focused, and you need to have a scope and sequence that creates not only focus around the standards and those pooled groupings I was talking about that introduce, master, and reinforce one unit, one grade level to the next, but in fact that are scaffolding and are creating a sense of momentum in the curriculum so that we're not lingering on rocks and minerals for a 3-month unit on earth science where we try to patch in some practices and you know, copy a scenario as a released item off somebody's test and you know, try to patch it together that way. That's a really kind of dirty way of doing things. And if you can bring these pieces together properly, then what happens is like hand in glove, clockwork. Things just really start to move. The children have the skills, they have the knowledge of the processes, and over that first 10 weeks, they internalize all of it, and then the following 10 weeks, they are refining, and then the final 10 weeks of the school year, they are really pushing the envelope, and that's you know, that's what you are looking for, and that's true, you know, from the earliest grade levels on up. So no more demonstrations, and instead put students thinking on the forefront. This is that model I was explaining earlier, where one of the key pivots is, of course, incorporating ELA and math. That's one of the peak alignment criteria. That's covered under another webinar called How to Assess Your Curriculum for Alignment with NGSS, which you can find on KnowAtom.com under the resources section at the top of the screen. So this happens, though, in multiple ways. Some I've already described. But that arc I was talking about, nonfiction reading first, transition to Socratic dialogue, then transition to a problem or question where the students in teams plan their investigations, then they carry out their investigations, and then they use the data from carrying out their investigation to form an evidence-based conclusion. So this is really a lesson, but a lesson doesn't take place just in one day. Okay, a lesson, if let's say we're talking about middle school, this would be 5 days, okay, or a little more, a little less. So really keep that in mind. The process, as I mentioned earlier, there's a scientific process, an engineering design process. This is one we've refined, you know, over 10 years, and again with hundreds of thousands of kids, and works really well, both of them, and are very true to the disciplines in the nature of science and engineering. If you go to any particular STEM firm, you know, they're going to have little tweaks on this, and in fact probably going to be much more complicated. But for students to learn the logic of how you pursue a question or a problem as a scientist or an engineer, this works really well. Now, another key piece is that the idea of engineering is being introduced. Well, it shouldn't happen in isolation. Engineering's not an add-on, okay? We don't play engineer. What we do is we use our scientific knowledge to solve problems. And the way you do that in a unit is to teach, for instance, here's an example from one of ours, where students are learning about water cycles. They're learning about the interaction between water and land and aquifers and groundwater. And so as scientists, they transition to a question around which earth materials are most permeable to groundwater. They structure an experiment, they use the materials available, gather their data, form their conclusion based on the evidence that they gathered in their data table. In the next lesson, they learn about pollution and the effects of pollution and what different sources of environmental pollution are and so on. And then you can imagine this idea of non-point source pollution and how that pollution travels from the surface to, let's say, wells miles away. Well, that's through the interaction between the land, the water cycle, and the water table, and groundwater flow. So as students learn about that, they then are able to function in the role of engineer to try to solve the problem of this fictional little town needing a low-cost water filtration device that costs less than $5 and only uses 3 different kinds of material to remove non-point source pollution in sediments from storm water runoff. So you can see they're going to use the engineering design process. So they take what they know, they survey the available materials, they design on some potential solutions, they pick one and diagram it, they then have a test to test it, they use that test, test it, and they gather the data, and then they use the data to decide whether or not they would refine or replicate. Okay, that's what we're looking for here. And here's, you know, example of some student trials and their data or outcomes. So that shows the direct interaction of the course of basically 2-3 lessons, how you go from science, you bridge through a concept like pollution, to engineering. Okay, and students are on the forefront of it all. It's relevant, it's timely, it's connected to multiple standards and multiple elements of all 3 performance to all 3 dimensions of each of the performance expectations. So really key. Now, you shouldn't be thinking about just assessing at the state level and kind of waiting for them to determine what's appropriate and if students are proficient. But you can actually mirror, and that's what we do, and you can see using scenarios in the classroom to tease out the different aspects of those dimensions. And here's an example from one of our units, and again, you can download these online and take a closer look. But scenario and then series of questions that tease out and really show whether or not the student has mastered the elements of the dimensions as well as can perform the expectation that's in its entirety. I mentioned earlier about ELA and math common core connections. Here's just a couple I selected. There's many more. Point here is just to show that evidence to support analysis using summarizing text distinct from prior knowledge, showing information visually, distinguishing between fact and speculation by reasoning and judgment. Those are all ELA technical subject standards, and these are middle school level. I want to point out following a multi-step procedure is not science. Creating the procedure is science. Following it is ELA. So if you're handing out procedures to folks, they're not only are those children not getting the correct skills, the proper skills they need, but they're also engaging in ELA over science. So, when you think of science time on learning, engage in science first, and then support ELA where it makes sense, because the two will support each other. But handing students a procedure is stripping the opportunity to learn the skill. These are the math practices, and again, it doesn't take any special training to understand that these practices relate in the environments we've been discussing. Making sense of problems, persevering in solving them, reasoning abstractly and quantitatively, constructing viable arguments, modeling with math, using tools strategically, attending to precision, making use of structure. All of these are things that you see are required by students learning in that next generation inquiry environment that I've been describing. One of the issues that you're going to face is a lot of resources that claim to be next generation and aren't, and just a lot of resources that aren't, that are left over and hanging around, and things that people create and they think that they are next generation aligned. So I'd refer you to Equip for Science as well as the peak alignment criteria. Peak is really good for understanding the district level and the school level articulation, and Equip at the unit and the lesson level. But I want to just kind of point out here that there's generally 4 types of resources. Awareness resources, which are produced by nonprofits that are raising money to create awareness around what's an engineer. Engineering's a basic thing and everybody can do it, and here's what an engineer does, all that kind of thing. Get them from museums, you get them from companies that use science and want to just say, hey, we use physics, when we do this. Students aren't, they're not ready to do anything more than just be aware. So if you ask a student what's an engineer, they can raise their hand and say engineers solve problems, but the student's not equipped to engage in solving problems. Knowledge-ready resources are things like textbooks that talk all about what scientists have discovered, engineers have created to solve problems. It's backward-looking. It's kind of archival and historic. It's the history of science and engineering. Regardless of how interactive and nice the pictures are, that's what we're talking about. Performance-ready resources are things like we often associate with kits, where students learn to perform a task, is what we're talking about. So learn all about the rocks, learn all about the minerals, what are their differences, what are their properties. Okay, now what you're going to do is follow these instructions and fill out this data table where you do a hardness test on these 10 different minerals and record it, and then maybe say why they're hard or different, what you saw. That's performance readiness. It's not equipping students to be able to go into an unfamiliar context that's not the result of direct instruction and apply skills to solve a problem or answer a question. That's what mastery readiness is all about. That's where we aim. That's when we align to NGSS, we're aligning to mastery ready levels, for those students. So, or reaching mastery ready levels readiness levels. And what that means is that developing a skill set, developing a knowledge set, and developing familiarity with the connection between the content and that content system behavior so that a student can actually look at an unfamiliar context, pull out the little bits that are related to something familiar, and then use the information, actually analyze it and evaluate it, and extend their own understanding to be able to form a claim or an opinion and support that with evidence and reasoning that they've extracted from the context itself. So, an example of that would be, the fictional contractor building a commercial kitchen has to put in a durable countertop, and there's 10 different options, all different materials, all different properties. Here's a table of the properties. He thinks he should put in the stainless steel countertop. Would you do you agree? Explain why he should or should not do that based on the evidence, and use evidence to support your reasoning. And so there, the student has to be able to analyze the scenario and the definitions and the data given in order to come to that evidence-based conclusion. So that's what we're talking about. Being able to think deeply, create, evaluate, analyze, apply the practices, use a process framework to logically construct what they need to construct, and do it within an unfamiliar context. And that's necessary because there's no, these contexts, the idea of an ecosystem, there are an infinite number of ecosystems. There's no way that you're going to be able to directly instruct students what every animal on Earth or plant or insect or whatever, what they eat, where they live, and how they interact with each other in nuanced ways, okay? So think about that. Ecosystem could be marine, Arctic, desert, tundra, could be anything, okay? I mentioned earlier that there's a connection between science and engineering and the arts, things like painting and sculpture and dance and music. Well, art is engineered communication. It's not about making things pretty. That's why famous artists like Pablo Picasso become famous, because they are often controversial and they make profound statements because they're engineering those statements specifically in the medium which they practice. So in the case of Pablo Picasso, it's oil on canvas, or sketches or whatever. That's also why in the wrong places where there's no freedom of speech or so on, different types of political persecution, that artists oftentimes end up in real big trouble and living in exile. And that happened to Pablo Picasso, and this is a good example of a statement he made to the fascists about the atrocities at Guernica, a town in Spain, where he came from. Spain is where he came from, and he made a statement about those atrocities when he was commissioned to do a work for an international art exposition, and this is the work. And so what he did was he painted the atrocities, and he named it Guernica, and he sent it to the international exposition, and everybody said, wow, this is what's going on. So this isn't particularly pretty. It's not colorful. It's not, interior decorators do pretty, but not artists. Artists create statements. So an artist, could decorate an interior of something, but the bottom line is that it's not about anything, at its root. What it is it's communication. So teaching children these science and engineering practices by putting their thinking on the forefront and sharpening their creative, evaluative, and analytical thinking skills, what we're doing is we are making children better communicators, better creators of art, better consumers of art. And frankly, it's that culture of critique as well. Artists are created through a culture of critique, whether it's formal or informal. And that's the same, that's the same truth of scientists and engineers who do things significant. They are the product of a culture of critique. It is how it is. And so those skills and those processes and that almost habits of mind are common to the science and engineering and arts as well. So I'm going to just wrap up here and let you know that, what again is, we've kind of been talking about this. Curriculum, materials, professional development are necessary. They need to be aligned. They should fit hand in glove. They should be grade level specific. They should nurture September through June and from one grade level to the next. They should pool concepts, be rigorous, engaging, and so on. So you're welcome to take a look at what we have available, but fitting hand in glove is key. Whether you create it or purchase it or whatever, it's key because you're supporting a series of learning experiences, quite frankly, that define that STEM learning environment where children are scientists and engineers. And the results are definitely quantifiable because, and here's some examples from Massachusetts, even under non-NGSS aligned state assessments, we still see significant gains in really difficult environments purely because the children can think about what they're being asked, and what they're being asked is not always what they had direct instruction on, and so they can work with what they know to extend it to the problem, question, scenario that they're being asked, and they're more resilient to shock. So I'll just kind of give you examples. So for Massachusetts, the state average is 50% advanced and proficient. And this example, the school added 51 points, well exceeding that 50% advanced and proficient to reach about 90%. And they've had shocks over time, changes in administration, changes in teachers, and so on. But what you can see here is that structure, that prior exposure, the skills and knowledge that students have, despite these major shocks, they don't fall all the way back to where they started. That in fact they are retaining these skills and using them and actually growing, and so you see a positive trend. And I'll tell you that this is an urban school. This is an elementary example. 72% low income, 65% free lunch, 75% high needs, 35% their first language is in English. So that's pretty tough. In places where there's only 20% high needs and 7% low income, and a more stable set of teachers and administrators, and what you see is, again, going from average to well above average, and those gains are made and sustained. And then the way to get from the 80s to 100% is really to get every last point and to really push students' thinking and creativity and such that they are, almost lawyers in a sense of looking at things from every angle and, making sure that it's all there. So that's basically where that comes in. But nonetheless, we're still well above state average. And then in places, let's use a middle school example here, one of the bottom in the state, in 2013, only 4% proficient. And when they started using our materials and we were working together, they gained 24 points over the course of 2 years. And at this point are now at the state average for the urban middle schools. So 26 largest cities in Massachusetts, this school is a part of one of those 26. They are at that point now at a point of progressing beyond that. And you can see the effect by teaching children to think and put their ideas on the forefront. They go from 54% to 27% warning and failing. So really dramatic in terms of closing the gap for student learning. And this is a difficult environment. Again, as I mentioned, 64% don't have English as their first language, 95% low income, 87% free and reduced lunch, 97% high needs. So there are easier situations to deal with than all of these pieces together, but yet it's still possible. And I have other examples which I won't show you now, but you're welcome to download. There's a case study, KnowAtom.com/results. You can take a look at how urban schools and children really new to the country, in fact, in many cases, and new sometimes to formal education, are well exceeding the peers in suburban districts, and in fact reaching the same levels we see in a lot of cases into the 80s and even beyond. So it's really quite something. This is an example from New Hampshire where you can see in purple and in yellow, anywhere from, and these are subsequent years of testing or consecutive years. The state averages in pink and in aquamarine here, anywhere from 10 to 30% above, depending on the particular strand that was being tested. And you can see where they're registering an inquiry. Those thinking skills are huge. So just some examples from testing that is not aligned, and looking forward to all the results from the testing that is aligned as it's been deployed this year. So it's exciting, and thank you for your time. I appreciate and hope that you were able to get some pointers, some use out of this in terms of your approach to the next generation science standards and really mastering them as you then go into strategically implementing them in the classroom. We do have a webinar available free and on demand at KnowAtom.com/strategically, really talking about that implementation piece, kind of boots on the ground, what that looks like. If you have any questions about anything you've seen, you want to contact me, have a question for me, my name is Francis Vigent. You can reach out to Mary Ellen DeLacy, who's one of our curriculum specialists, mdelacy@knowatom.com. Call her on the phone, 617-475-3475. She would be happy to talk to you and answer any questions and forward something to me, and I'd be happy to get back to you personally. There are a few other resources I'll let you know about, ways to stay connected. Like I said, our materials and curriculum are available for purchase if you're at an implementation phase, or you have a curriculum committee that's really trying to crack the code, or you've gone down the road and now you understand things better and are looking to kind of put something in turnkey. But we don't deal with teachers directly. We deal with schools and districts. So in terms of the sales, so we don't sell to teachers. But there's examples of those materials which teachers can access under KnowAtom.com/curriculum, like that case study I mentioned earlier, KnowAtom.com/results. And you can connect on our blog, Facebook, or Twitter. Our handles at KnowAtom for Twitter, Facebook.com/KnowAtom, and KnowAtom.com/blog for those different resources. We have a bunch of ebooks live. We have ebooks live as well as on-demand webinars, all kinds of different things, interviews with innovators on our website. You can check that all out under KnowAtom.com/resources. Again, my name is Francis Vigent. Thank you again for your time, and I wish you luck as you implement and test the next generation science standards in Washington. Take care. Bye-bye.